Well, good morning and welcome to everyone, especially our mothers. We're always glad to celebrate a day that honors you. And this morning, as we begin our service, we focus the first hour on the Lord and on His death, burial, and resurrection in which He accomplished this great victory for us over sin and death. This morning, I want to recount for you the story of one of His great praiseworthy deeds that occurred about 1,000 years before the life of Jesus, but is one that I believe foreshadows the life of Christ, and particularly His conquering of death and sin. The story is recorded in 1 Samuel chapters 4, 5, and 6. And I want to give you first the larger context, the immediate context, and then we'll get into the story itself. The larger context is that when God brought the children of Israel into their promised land, He told them that as long as they were faithful to Him and kept the terms of the covenant and did not go astray after other gods or corrupt themselves in any way, that they would remain prosperous in the land and have victory over their enemies. But that if they turned from God and corrupted themselves, that they would suffer at the hands of their enemies. And ultimately, if they persisted in their evil, that God would take them into exile. He would take them out of their promised land into a foreign place. Now, at the time that this story happens, Eli is the high priest and the judge over Israel. And he's not terribly wicked himself, but he has, the story tells us, grown old. And there's nothing immoral about growing old, but he was also fat, and there's not necessarily anything immoral about being heavy, but that he's also blind. There's nothing immoral about losing our sight. We often do as we grow older in years. But there's something about the way that those three descriptors of Eli are put together in the story that is, I think, trying to indicate to us something about the condition of his regime, of his house, and his leadership in his days. It was growing old, it had grown heavy, and it was blind, unable to see the way forward. And I think that we really begin to grasp the significance of his leadership's decline in his two sons. They were corrupt. In fact, we're told two things in particular: that they assaulted the virgins who served at the tabernacle, and that they also took for themselves the meat that the people would come and offer as sacrifices to God at the tabernacle. Instead of offering them up as sacrifices to God, they would take the meat for themselves. And so they did not honor God. They violated other people's rights and dignity and abused their power. And so as a consequence of this, God had given Israel over into the hands of their great enemy at that time, the Philistines. And so we're told that in a battle at Ebenezer, the Israelites lost 4,000 warriors at the hands of the Philistines. And so the elders of the people wanted a solution to this problem, and we're told in 1 Samuel 4, beginning in verse 3, that the elders said, "Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. So they didn't think, well, we should perhaps check ourselves and consider whether our defeat at the hands of the Philistines is due to our corrupt ways, and maybe we need to repent and reform and seek God's forgiveness and blessing. Instead, they just said, well, let's just go get the ark out of the tabernacle that was at that time in Shiloh, bring it up here along with these two corrupt priests, and maybe because of God's thinking of him sort of as a lucky charm in our presence, then we'll have victory over the Philistines. So they do this, and in verse 10 and 11, we see that the outcome was actually even worse. It says, "The Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great, Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers, 30,000 as opposed to 4,000 in the previous battle. And it says that the ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So an unmitigated disaster, a huge rout of their army. The priests are killed, and the ark of the covenant, where God is enthroned between the cherubim over the ark, has been captured by the Philistines and taken into their territory. When the word of this reached Shiloh, where Eli, the high priest and father of the two young men who had been killed, was waiting to hear what would happen, when the word got to him, it says that he was told the bad news, but when he heard specifically about the ark being captured and taken captive by the Philistines, that Eli, who again is old and heavy, fell over backwards from the seat that he was sitting on and his neck was broken and he died. And not only that, but his daughter-in-law, one of his wicked son's wives, was so traumatized by the event that she went into labor and died in giving birth. But before she died, she named the son Ichabod, which means the glory has departed, because the glory of the Ark of the Covenant had been taken captive by the Philistines. It seems that the ultimate punishment for covenant breaking, that was to be exile of the people out of the land, has interestingly been absorbed by God himself. He is the one who goes into exile, as it were, on behalf of his people. Rather than letting all the people at this point be taken captive and displaced from the land, God himself, in the symbol of the Ark of the Covenant, allows himself, his glory, to be exiled out of the land. That's the first thing that I want us to notice. Secondly, as you can imagine, because of their victory over Israel, the Philistines are elated. This is wonderful. And it's not just because we've won the battle, but because apparently our God, who they call Dagon, is more powerful than Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so we have conquered our enemy, we have conquered our enemy's God, and as a consequence, they bring the Ark of the Covenant into the tabernacle, into the temple rather, of Dagon, and set it there beside Dagon as perhaps an image of Dagon's victory over the God of Israel. And it says in 1 Samuel 5, verses 1 through 3, that after the Philistines had captured the ark, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. What an amazing reversal. And then verse 4, but the following morning, that is now the third day since it's been taken captive, they rose early in the morning again, and there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and his head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. So Dagon fallen before the ark, his head and right and left hands broken off before the threshold. And so God's apparent defeat, this is the important thing I want us to notice, the apparent defeat that God had suffered and his exile of humiliation into the land of the Philistines, subdued by the God of the Philistines, is now conquering. And he begins this conquest first by the conquering of the gods of the Philistines, by conquering Dagon and subduing him. And so he begins to work this great victory. And I knew this was a bad idea, trying to use this. There we go. All right. So God's apparent defeat and capture positions him behind the enemy lines, where he is now able to work a great victory, starting with the gods of the Philistines. And of course, the Philistines are just, maybe the technical Hebrew word here is they're freaked out by what has happened. Things were going so good, everything was going our way, but now everything seems to be going the other way. Our God seems to be being subdued by the God that we thought he had conquered. And not only that, there begins to be a plague breaking out in the city there where the ark had been taken. And so the ark becomes a hot potato, if you will, and begins to be passed around through the major cities of the Philistines, starting there at Ashdod. It's moved to Gath, where Goliath will be from later, and then moved to Ekron before finally being sent home. But everywhere that the ark goes, a plague breaks out. And so it says in chapter 5, verse 11, that they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people." For death had filled the city with panic, for God's hand was heavy on it. So not only do they return the Ark of the Covenant to Israel at this time, but they do so with a chest, a treasure chest, filled with 10 golden objects as a trespass offering, acknowledging that they had trespassed against the God of Israel, who had defeated their God, plagued their cities, and they're acknowledging God's superiority as they send him back into Israel. So in summary, God suffers a defeat, goes down into exile, he defeats his enemies there, and comes back with great glory. Now this praiseworthy deed that God accomplished is celebrated later in Psalm 78, beginning in verse 60, which says this. I'm going to put this on the screen for us. That he abandoned his dwelling, that is, God abandoned his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among mankind, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. This is a reference to the ark. And it says he gave his people over to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage, the defeat that they suffered, Israel suffered in the battles. Fire devoured their young men, and their young women had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awoke as if from sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine, and he put his adversaries to rout. He put them to everlasting shame. So the psalm, again, in poetic form, describes what we have just recounted in 2 Samuel's historical account. It appeared that God had fallen asleep, that he had turned a deaf eye to his people, or deaf ear to his people, a blind eye to his people, and that he was doing nothing. He was allowing his people to be slaughtered, but this, of course, was because of their sin. But in his mercy, when he was taken captive among the Philistines, there he worked an even greater defeat of their enemies, showing them great mercy, and returns with glory. I don't put that part on the screen, but the psalm ends by describing the ascent of the ark back to Israel and ultimately up to Mount Zion, not just back to Shiloh, but now in Jerusalem to Mount Zion, where it will be placed not in a tabernacle but a temple, and David will ascend to the position of king and glory. So this describes the transition of Israel from the period of judges to kings, from the temple, from the ark being housed at the corrupt tabernacle in Shiloh to its glorious dwelling in the temple on Mount Zion, and David reigning as king. So God, through all of this mess, through all this chaos, brings about a glorious victory. This is the point of Psalm 78. So Psalm 78 traces the path of God's glory through the grave of Philistia into the throne of Zion, foretelling the very path that Jesus would one day tread. So consider very quickly some of the similarities between the ark and Jesus. like the ark was taken by violence into the hand of the Philistines, Jesus was taken by violence into the hands of his foes. And like the ark that went into the grave of exile and was sealed within the temple of Dagon, only to be discovered early in the morning victorious over Dagon, so Jesus entered the exile of the grave, deep within the domain of the prince of darkness, only to be discovered early in the morning on the third day to have overthrown the prince of darkness. And thirdly, like the ark defeated Dagon on his home turf and then rampaged the Philistine cities like an inflamed warrior, Jesus awakens on the third day to crush the head of Satan and to break his right hand sin and his left hand death and leave them broken on the threshold. When the corrupt priesthood and elders of Israel handed Jesus over to Pilate to be delivered up to be crucified, they had no idea that this would be their own demise. In 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8, none of the rulers of this world imagined this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Colossians 2:15, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. And most importantly, Hebrews 2:14, it says, by his death he broke the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil. The bonds of death could no more hold Jesus than Dagon and the Philistines could hold the ark within Dagon's temple. And so I want to conclude this morning by looking once again at Psalm 78, but looking at the opening section there. It says, the things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us, we will not hide them from our children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders that he has done. That's what we're doing in part here this morning. And every week we come together at this place and gather around this table, and we partake of this bread and drink this cup in remembrance of what the Lord has done, of the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord. And we declare them to the watching world, and we declare them to the next generation, to our children. We speak to them about the wonders that the Lord has done, and we will not cease to do so. Because as great as God's rout of the Philistines and of the false god Dagon was at the hands of the ark, how much greater is the defeat of Satan, sin, and death at the hands of the Lord Jesus. And we will not fail to recount his praiseworthy deeds and to tell of his power and the wonders he has done. And so we're going to, at this time, pause and do just that. We're going to sit at this table and pause to remember these praiseworthy deeds of the Lord. This time, with those appointed to serve, please come forward.